Good evening, everyone. We are on YouTube Live and Twitter Live as well as LinkedIn Live right now. We may begin in 5 to 6 minutes at max once our guests come in. So please wait for 2 to 5 minutes. I think then we may begin. Thanks. Hi, Shashank. We have sent you a speaker request, so you can take that. Um, I guess once a few more. Yeah. Hi, Shashank. Aditya, I think you can let me know. I guess we can start in 2 to 3 minutes as you consider. I think we will expect speakers to join in, so let's see. Yeah. Aditya, I guess we should start the discussion. Anyways, I think our guest will be joining in the meanwhile, so I think we should, continue. It's already 5 to 6 minutes. So, what do you think?
Is Shashank joining?
Most probably he will in a while. So let's see. But I think we already have Rishabh, so I think we can begin.
Will use finest also join?
You can DM me on that. I guess we should start. Yeah.
I think we can wait for a couple of minutes more.
No, I suggest 1 minute more, I think, because after 1 minute we should just start right away. I yeah,
Okay,
I
sure,
think
sure.
I think we can start now. We just can start, most probably. Let's just begin. Yeah.
Is it episode 2 or episode 1?
It is episode two. Since we had one on the Data Protection Act, so this is episode two, but it's also kind of a welcome again. So yeah.
Okay. So, welcome listeners. After a long break, we are back with the Globalized series for Bharat Pacific podcast. I'm joined here by Abhivardhan and, of course, Use Finest, who is a anonymous handle and quite vocal on lot of strategic and military issues on Twitter. And we have Rishabh, who is also a faculty member of NMIMS. And if I'm not wrong, he teaches foreign policy there, international relations, IR. And most probably, if I'm not wrong, Abhivardhan, uh, Shashank Matto, who covers foreign policy for Live Mint, may join us if everything goes fine. And today's topic that we all will be discussing is pre summit expectations. Which summit? Of course, it's G20 summit. We are going to have G20 summit next week. It's the largest diplomatic event India is hosting. I don't know in how many decades. There is a lot of hype around it. India has spent a lot of diplomatic and administrative capital on promoting G20. The ruling dispensation has used it as a quite a tool as its own political agenda. So there is a lot of political capital spent on it. In addition to all this hype and all, um, this is probably like the culmination of the current state of current series of high diplomatic agenda that the government had, beginning with the state visit to United States, then the Bastille Day visit to France, then recent BRICS summit, which was also followed up by the visit to Greece in, like, if I'm not wrong, in 4 decades. It was the first visit by the Prime Minister in 4 decades. All this will be culminating with the end of G20 summit in the next week. While all this is there, there were also quite a few controversies leading up to this. India has not been able to manage any joint agreement between all the 20 nations in any department, in any area till now, in any policy field. And of course, we know main reason behind it. It comes down to Russia and China and the language they seek in these agreements. So Western nations would like to have certain kind of commitments in these agreements, and Russia and China won't want that. They want different kind of language to be used, or at least they are demanding what not to be used in the agreements. And in addition to all this, we know that Putin won't be coming to the G20 summit. While Putin's not coming was expected, what was a bummer or kind of, I guess some people expected that, but not entirely until last week, that Xi Jinping won't also join the summit. So that's a bummer. So Chinese premier will be joining. It's not the Xi Jinping president who will be joining the summit. And in addition to that, China has released a quite a controversial map, reaffirming Arunachal Pradesh as its own territory just before the G20 summit. Mm. So there is all this, and one wonders if India will be able to manage to have at least one final joint statement between all the heads of state by the end of the summit. And if India won't be able to do that, then it will be the first G20 host that won't be able to successfully have any kind of joint statement from the member nations. So there's a lot going on. So to discuss all these issues, and of course there is a global South issues. India's proposal to have African Union as a one member of the G20. So when that happens, maybe it won't be G20 anymore, G21. But let's see uh, where all this will lead up to. So, what's happening? What are you expecting? And welcome back.
First of all, thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be back. And I'd just like to make like two broad points. So the first point I'll start off with is, I mean, I fully expect Justin Trudeau to do something that once again manages to strain relations between India and Canada. Like, I pray I'm wrong. I pray everything goes completely fine. But given his track record, I am not at all confident. And given who is responsible for keeping his government in power, I'm even less sure about everything going as planned. The reason I say this is because I'm sure everyone here has read about it. India was sort of hoping to, if not talk about Ukraine, at least keep it under wraps so that some of the other things India wanted to touch upon would get more attention or see the light of day. But Justin Trudeau was apparently told, Justin Trudeau has told Vladimir Zelensky that he will, quote unquote, talk about Ukraine in at the G20 summit. So there is that, and it's I just like to make another statement related to this, which is now that we look back at the Harper years, it's sort of amazing to think that that period where people at least privately said that uh, diplomacy was more milk toast. There wasn't like anything exciting happening between anything exciting, as in there weren't any grand overtures between India and Canada. That that era is now looked upon with so much nostalgia. And I think it also goes, at least personally, I think it's been a really missed account because the potential for Indo-Canadian ties are incredible. I mean, it can be one of the greatest ties for both India and Canada, but it's just sad to see where it's gone due to various political compulsions we don't really need to get into. The second thing I wanted to bring up is while I understand that a lot of people come at this from a slightly more cynical lens, saying that it's basically a giant talk shop, that nothing's really going to get done, that this is all in all a giant much ado about nothing. I tend to disagree. What I think is happening is that the G20, even if it's not immediately satiating a lot of expectations that people have, it is a signal that India is slowly arriving at the world stage. Sure, we're not yet China, we're not like really dominating the information space, we're not dominating the geopolitical space, agreed. But it tells you a lot that a country that was once a fragile five is now able to assert itself this confidently in the international space. And while there will be people who will knock on this and say, yeah, well, what about the substance? You have to realize that just because you don't have the capabilities to aspire to something doesn't mean you just sit back and don't do anything. Like if you, just to give a separate example, if you look at Sri Lanka, right? For a very long time, we let that relationship go stale. And we didn't do the things that was needed to keep the relationship on track, and we let certain other players come in and take advantage of that fact. But since then, there has been a consistent neighborhood first push, at least since 2015, 2016, from the government side. And when an opportunity manifested itself, and because India had grown to the degree where it did have those capabilities to step in and at least provide partial relief to the problems that Sri Lanka was going through, it did that. And now, when you look back and you look at where Indo Sri Lankan ties are and the kind of things India has managed to do in terms of expanding its influence, and I use expanding influence in a positive sense. It makes sense to have what people would otherwise describe as positioning, simply because when you're at the table saying the things that need to be said, when you eventually do get the capabilities, it allows you to, how do I put this politely? Um, it allows you to create a mold into which you can fit, which smoothens out the process. It's slightly difficult to put into words, but that's how I look at it.
Rishabh, would you like to add to that? Your like expectations from the summit? Hello, Rishabh.
Yeah, can you hear
Sorry.
me?
Yes, yes.
Um, I'm not sure about the expectations. I I I mean that will actually depend on what I mean. How do we define what I mean? What we're looking for? But in terms of what we were talking about, joint communiques and statements and whatnot, or India's failure to come up with one in any of the other meetings, etc. I mean, yes, to some extent it does matter, or it does, in some ways, it's basically some sort of very low level PR kind of an issue. But substance wise, it doesn't really matter. Uh, I'm not talking about the joint communique of the leader summit, which is obviously the most important one, right? But the other smaller one, which is related to finance, foreign minister meet, etc., trade, etc. Now, it's not unheard of that I mean that the host countries have been unable to garner joint statements on those issues or on those sideline meetings, right? Indonesia, for example, last year there were no joint statements or communiques when it came to climate talks, finance, etc. Right? Obviously, they did manage to get the last and the final and the major joint communique in that sense, and that obviously led to some sort of compromise from both sides, and that obviously is not happening in India's case. Now, I would say that India should, or at least from a foreign policy perspective, diplomatic perspective, India should obviously try to get try to come up with, or try to get these countries to some sort of adjustment if it's possible. Obviously we would like a joint statement, right? But I don't think it is an imperative for us to do so, especially if we are being put in a place where we put out something which reflects very badly on us either way, right? So I don't think that we should measure the success of G20, etc., uh, and or how it has been useful for us from that being the only metric, right? Um, I mean, there are multiple reasons why. Obviously, China and Russia feel that they can probably get something out of India. They obviously know that India has invested a lot of capital on this summit. Also, obviously, we've talked about even the domestic politics, and then the stakes that are there. Obviously, it will the failure to have a joint statement or joint communique, so to speak, will have some sort of impact. But I don't think we should be gauging it from that perspective. um, I think what is going to be important here is um, India's ability to convince at least not just the global south per se, but other middle powers, etc., that it is a country which is more serious about what it wants, what issues it prioritizes and stands up for in the international community. And I think you will see that there will be a lot of bilateral meetings which will be happening in the sidelines. Obviously, we don't still know whether, I mean, officially we don't know whether Xi Jinping would be visiting India or not. But people have to understand this, that this talking about global south and some of the disparities that exist in the current global order is not something which is going to be forgotten after this summit. Just again, a reminder that the next two summits are in the G20 summits. It will be hosted by Brazil and South Africa. So these kind of issues are still going to be important. I mean, if the war drags on as it has for such a long time, you would see at the financial and the trade conditions of some of these countries, especially if there is no debt relief provided to some of the smaller economies, it's going to get a little challenging, right? So in that sense, I think what India has to do is obviously look at the, you know, the things that will get the spotlight, etc., from a PR perspective. But I think just being bold enough to put its position out there, not being shaken by uh, which country is attending and which country is saying what. I think, that is something which I think a lot of countries, especially the countries in the global south, will look at, right? So I think for me, I mean, I don't know what there are many other metrics, obviously, but in what a lot of people have been saying that, oh, G20 statements, etc., have to produce something concrete. Well, we would love, if that actually happens, but as we've seen in the past, that they don't really do much when it comes to deliverables. So maybe what India can do, and I think other countries, especially the Western countries, would also probably hope, and hopefully they'll be able to listen to India on this, would be to look at debt relief for some of these countries which are struggling with their debt obligations. So maybe achieving some sort of commitments on that could be seen as a win to some extent. But I think we'll have to wait and see, right?
So, Rishabh, that is where I want to interject. Now, debt relief was kind of like the biggest hot potato of this summit, if I recollect. I mean, of course, there are other small agreements like on development agenda, climate, etc. But many were looking forward for what kind of agreements they will make on debt restructuring, debt relief for the poor, or at least poor, developing and middle income countries, possibly. But there hasn't been much update. Like, I don't think there has been any movement forward on that, like what will be the modalities of it. Whatever the little restructurings that have happened, for instance, recently Pakistan or Sri Lanka or any other, they have been on the individual capacities of the respective nations and their respective friendly nations. For instance, India helped restructure Sri Lanka's debt, and it kind of used its back end power at IMF to get a favorable deal for Sri Lanka. But I don't think anything as per G20, like
See, I think
nothing.
G20, sorry to interject. See, G20 itself does not have the modalities to implement this themselves. What G20 does, and in some cases, although very rarely, has been able to do, is to push a kind of like an agenda setting, paradigm in terms of what countries are saying they will do or they ought to focus at. So obviously, I don't think that uh, even a commitment would necessarily lead to any action. But what I am saying is that India's ability to convince major countries, especially countries in the Western world who have a lot of pull and sway with the dominant financial and global institutions, to look at this would be a kind of a win in itself, right? So there may not have been any movement on such a commitment, but I'm saying that there is a possibility that some of the countries do kind of come around and support this, even if it is only in name, right? What will be the modalities or technicalities of it, and whether they will actually commit to anything, and write something written on paper, I'm not so sure. But just acknowledgement of the problem itself, uh, in diplomatic terms, is a kind of a win, because this is how the G20 works, right? I mean, it's not really action oriented as it's portrayed, but from an Indian perspective, I think just that acknowledgement will go a far way for smaller countries or other countries which are watching, right? Because again, and I say this because I think there has been some introspection in the Western world, um, you know l- in terms of looking at, okay, the fact that there hasn't been decentralization in terms of decision making structures or other global governance reforms. And there's been a lot of talk about multilateral forums being, this being that, led by this country, etc. So there's been a lot of competitive talk on that, and I'm hoping that some other countries will take up notice, especially the United States and some European countries will take up notice and see that, okay, there is a problem, or there are some problems which are there, not just, by the way, only as a byproduct of the Russia-Ukraine war. So I'm just saying that there could be some acceptance of this action. Whether it will lead to concrete action, obviously I'm skeptical. But again, from an Indian perspective, just getting these countries to speak on it would be something which will be considered a win. And again, maybe not through G20, maybe through bilateral or trilateral declarations, right? Again, not as joint statements, but just products of their meetings and whatnot.
So we are joined by Shashank here, Shashank Mattu, who covers foreign affairs for LiveMint. Welcome, Shashank. Uh, so Shashank, this question is to you. Like, US Finest and Rishabh has given their initial comments. Now we have heard that there hasn't been any agreement as per se, or uh, like collective agreement that has been agreed upon by all the G20 member states. But has there been any concrete policy movement that has happened where, okay, some work has been done? Now, India has tried to make Global South as the focus area of this summit, and many were hyping it up as saying after perhaps 2008 financial crisis, the initial couple of G20 summits were very productive, but after that, nothing much has happened. And many hope that last year's Indonesia summit, this year's India summit, and next year's Brazil summit, these three summit together will actually bring some concrete outcomes, especially for the global south out of this. So many meetings that have happened out of these meetings. So, did anything substantial happen this year out of all these meetings?
Thank you so much. I have to say that from my perspective as foreign affairs correspondent for the Mint, I think that I've sort of seen a dramatic scale down in terms of ambition on part of the various countries taking part in G20. I may, of course, be completely wrong, but I remember going after the G20 foreign ministers meeting to some people in the ministry and talking to them about what looks like a successful outcome for you guys. And they said, look, we'd love to get something on debt relief for developing countries. We'd love to get something on climate financing. If you sort of look at what the UNDP has been saying, the UN has been sort of screaming themselves hoarse about this idea of spending $500 billion additionally every year for developing countries. Everyone going through sort of a rollback on SDGs. There's a debt relief problem. And so I think that a lot of people sort of sat back and said, okay, we need money for developing countries. I think that recently I was speaking to someone, a Japanese diplomat, and they said, look, from our perspective right now, what seems the big win will sort of be the African Union being added to the G20 as a permanent member. That seems like something that no country is going to say no to. So we'll be talking about the G21 soon. But beyond that, it's at this point in time, it's hard to say whether anything will come out. There was this a lot of conversation in July about the fact that this independent experts group was set up, which is headed by one of India's most distinguished financial bureaucrats, N.K. Singh and Lawrence Summers, who used to be the US Treasury Secretary. And they sat together and sort of hammered out this report where they suggested reforms to multilateral development banks and so on and so forth, and sort of seeing whether the World Bank could lend more for climate change and so on. If we get something on that, that would be fantastic. Something on climate change, something on debt relief. The G20 has this thing called the Common Framework, and for resolving debt problems for developing countries. So far, it's only worked out in Zambia, but we know that the Chinese have been sort of a stumbling block in making the Common Framework move faster. In fact, I interviewed the UNDP administrator recently, and he was very clear that, look, this G20 Common Framework has not moved fast enough. So if you have that move fast enough, if we're able to add more countries to that ambit, if we're able to get something on climate finance, if we're able to get something on debt relief, and we're able to add the African Union, and somehow if we're magically able to get a joint communique, which I don't think at this point is possible, those are good outcomes, and I think we should pat ourselves on the back for it. But honestly, in terms of concrete policy outcomes at this point in time, it's unclear whether those things have been sort of hammered out. If those things happen, it's a great summit, fantastic, well done for us. But if it doesn't work out, I do fear that then I think some obvious questions will be asked, and I think then the government will say then that, look, this is exercise in getting countries to talk to each other, as was being said earlier, and it's G20 is a reflection of where countries are. India is checking, bring them together, get them to sit again with each other and talk to each other about these things, but not necessarily sort of push them and say that, listen, you need to get this done. So I think that from where I'm sitting, if we get these things done, fantastic. If we don't, it's not the end of the world, but I think then there will be questions about, okay, because unlike a lot of other G20 presidents, we have put in a lot of political capital. It's plastered all over the country and so on and so forth. So this will become a domestic political issue, right? People are invested. So I think people will ask, what came out of this, right? And I think that, everyone best have some decent answers for that, especially the Ministry of External Affairs. That's what I think at this point in time.
Yeah.
There seems to be a lot of requests. At the moment, we are like 5 speakers, and there isn't enough time for others to chip in. We would like this discussion like non-cacophony, so only we 5 of us will speak mostly. Maybe if there is time in the end for 5-10 minutes, we can take a couple of questions, but mostly it will be just 5 of us. So
Yeah.
don't mind. Yes.
Yeah. Another way
So
that can be done is that, you can reply to the main tweet of this space and
yeah,
text,
yeah,
and
you
we will
can
read your
comment down
questions.
below. Then, if there
Yeah.
are any interesting questions, we can take it up.
Yeah.
So,
We'll just
Abhivardhan,
feature.
you had some question.
Yeah. So Shashank, um, this has been an eventful year, right? I mean, we had the Raisina dialogue, we had the T20 conferences, we had so many diplomatic events, but beyond the regular diplomatic events which happen when it comes to the G20, uh, obviously development economics and issues related to them will be the most important to prove if the G20 is really that impactful grouping, because we also know how a part of the world reacts to the G7, right? So when we look at the role of the G20 per se, of course, we have had, have a block of players. We have people from the Pax Americana side, which is to say US and Western Europe. We have stakeholders from Latin America. We have stakeholders from Africa. We have stakeholders from the Far East, like China and ASEAN states. Um, from a general point of view, while definitely India has this pressure to ensure that the presidency under New Delhi really delivers something on issues like debt relief, finance, climate, digital technologies, which I'm sure that in some areas we might do, and in some areas we might not do, like it happened in the Indonesia's case, as Rishabh pointed out. Um, what do you think about the countries which have been participated with this whole presidency so far? Like, so for example, there are a set of countries which foster on the value of SEO, BRICS, etc. Right? And they think that they are more relevant than the G7 and NATO and all those kind of frameworks. Obviously, I'm not directly relating to the alliance system, but what I'm trying to say is that obviously there are a set of countries which have their own interests and considerations. Obviously, Ukraine was also very participative in the G20 meetings, not just on the conflict, but also other things. So, when you look at the groupings of countries when it comes to their own interests per se, uh, how have they been interactive to India per se, and how have they been interactive to the presidency? Because there have been a lot of bilateral meetings when peak events like Raisina and others have happened, right? So, what do you think about it?
So you mentioned development economics and you mentioned the interests of countries. I can tell you that so on development economics, I'll answer this with a very targeted example of where there is some dissonance between the countries, and which is why sort of expecting us to pull a rabbit out of the hat with this sort of presidency might be a little harder. The question is that, look, like I said, the UN, for example, has been asking for $500 billion every year, a commitment of that nature from developed countries for developing countries that are going through debt crisis, climate change. They need adaptation, they've been suffered due to COVID, and so on and so forth. So the problem is that, and this has been very frankly acknowledged by a lot of senior people on all sides that I've spoken to, is that the developed countries just don't have the money to sort of give them what they want. They don't have the money. They're all going through a financial pinch. I mean, if you look at some of the countries, Italy certainly going through a financial pinch. UK most certainly, they can't run their national health service. They're not exactly in a position do that. I mean, if you look at this whole Chandrayaan thing that happened, this whole controversy about this aid to India and so on and so forth, it reflects in Britain an increasing mindset that, look, we're not a rich country anymore. We have scarcity. we need to, guard our resources, right? So, will you be able to get any sort of support if your NHS isn't working? Will you be able to get any support to give developing countries money? So that's one dissonance, because you specifically asked about developing economics and how different groups are engaging with this and where that puts us. This is just tying it together with one example, which is that this is one clear example of how countries have very, very different interests when it comes to approaching the G20. The second example, of course, is just this question of Ukraine. Again, the Chinese have been very clear that, look, this is an economic grouping. We don't want to talk about Ukraine, and so on and so forth. But I put out this interview on my Twitter, if anyone's interested in reading it, which is that the German G20 Sherpa who we interviewed said very clearly, we will not sign a joint statement that does not condemn Russia's aggression. And so there's the Ukraine angle, which is another sign of how a particular group of countries are perfectly happy to sort of say that, look, this is why are you bringing Ukraine? They're happy enough to have Ukraine, perhaps, but they don't want it to derail any sort of major agreements and so on and so forth. So that's another example of this sort of West-East, not East divide, but like the Sino-Russian alliance on one side and our friends in the West. That's another divide that countries are seeing. So as far as I understand, those are really some of the issues. And Ukraine is an issue from the different side from the West, right? Because and I think Use Finance put out a tweet about this, which I thought was very on point, which is about Justin Trudeau sort of taking that call with Zelensky and saying, "Oh, we're very disappointed that you weren't invited to the G20 this year," right? So it seems like India in the middle is sort of the West has this agenda on Ukraine. So Ukraine is one issue. Development economics between rich countries and poor countries, and more developing countries, sorry, and Ukraine Ukraine food security. Russia is on one side on that, especially when it comes to this Black Sea grain deal. The West is on one side. So you see that on a number of issues, development economics, politics, etc. It's everyone is coming at this with their own set of interests, and India has to sort of sit together and get something going. And that's the situation we're in.
Yeah, so if anyone wants to read Shashank's interview with G20 Sherpa, I have attached the link above. You can access it there. So, I would like to come back to you. Now, it seems to be like a permanent division, like permanent fissure between the China-Russia bloc and the rest. And there are countries in between like Indonesia, India, Brazil in the G20. Now, I don't think this fissure will suddenly go away even for the next G20 summit in Brazil. So where is this going? So is it just going to be wine and dine? Will there be something that these countries will finally do? If there is nothing they want to do, then United Nations is good enough, right, to do something. At least they used to have common joint agreements all this while. It doesn't seem like there will be one. I mean, at least I hope there will be one, but all the indication shows that there might not be even a final agreement in that. And if that doesn't happen, which is so I mean, I get that there isn't much deliverable, but at least we used to get some symbolism from G20. Even if we can't get the symbolism, then what's the use of G20 or 21? Like we may add African Union tomorrow, we may add like 100 other countries, but if we are just going to add and do nothing, we already have United Nations to do that, right? So what's the use of it?
I mean, the use of it is you want to keep as many avenues open as possible, right? Like, so going back to the earlier example I made about Sri Lanka, I realized I butchered this point, but what effectively I was trying to say is just because you don't have the capabilities does not mean you don't take the opportunity to set your agenda forward, right? So, like, I know this is like a highly controversial opinion, but when you're building up your capabilities, you also aim for a goal, right? And sometimes you're able to use multiple different forums, especially multilateral forums, to say, hey, you know what, we're a rising power. This is what our agenda is. This is what we would like to do. And even if we like fail to get consensus on certain things, at least the partners that we want to work with into the future, especially incredibly strategic ones like, for example, the UAE, which I find quite interesting, we haven't touched upon yet, that they know where we stand. They know that we are up and coming, and that when we do grow into those capabilities, we are able to step in and help out, right? And now people will say, well, this is just talking shop. Well, it's not talking shop, Because what happened is, for a very long time, I remember this, I got into arguments with people, especially around 2017, 2018. And then when Minister Jaishankar had just gotten into the government, there was a lot of stick I copped for saying that India's neighborhood first policy isn't simply talk shop or a joke. I mean, the government was quite serious about it. And eventually, India did, our capabilities have grown. And now that we got an opportunity to help Sri Lanka out, we did help them. And if you look at where Indian influence is in Sri Lanka today, it's in a much, much better place than it was, say, even 10 to 15 years ago, right? So I agree. I'm not saying that, okay, we don't know what's going to happen in the G20, right? Let's just go with that line. We don't know. But let's assume the worst case, that we get nothing. I would still say that this G20 has been good for India because at least the partners that we want to reach know where we stand, be it the West, be it the East. Now, sure, China's going to be China, and they're doing their own version of Akhand Asia, so let them be them. But for the rest of the countries in the mix, they know where we stand, and I think that is extremely important because uh, I am extremely bullish on India. I think India's capabilities are going to grow even further. And when we become that power we all aspire to be, um, we will look back to moments like this and be thankful because it allowed us to get our word out onto the world stage. And it's quite ironic that I have to make this point because one of the most common complaints you'll see on the IR side of Twitter is that government is like horrible at communication, or that it's not able to get its agenda out, or it doesn't set the narrative properly, or it lets other people choose the framework within which it wants to operate. And G20, I mean, is literally an opportunity, and the government is grabbing it with both arms to let India set the framework, right? And even if we don't arrive at a consensus, notice that there is at least a moderate shift, right? Like people are saying, yeah, the West wants Ukraine, China does not want to talk about Ukraine, but they're also mentioning that this is what India wants, which is India wants the global South to be represented. We want talk of debt, we want talk of climate financing, and that is seeping through to the players we want to reach. So I'll stop with that.
But Rishabh, what does China want from this summit? Like they are completely not interested in it because it seemed like Xi will make it President Xi, and in the last minute, in the last 10 days, everything went like south. I mean, it seemed like it was quite okay at BRICS summit, right? At least, and the moment BRICS summit was over, then they release all these maps and they declare that President Xi is not joining. What's happening there? Like, are they not entirely interested?
I don't think Xi Jinping, like, I mean, we don't, again, just to be sure, we don't know whether he is not coming officially. I mean, although all the indication obviously point to that in that direction. Um, First of all, I think the map issue, as I mean, obviously it was something which is was condemned by a lot of countries. It's kind of like a PR nightmare. I think it would have been a PR nightmare for any other Asian country, or especially in as a power, an aspiring power, so to speak. But I don't think it is something which really affects China that much, especially considering that this is not something that has happened for the first time. Obviously, in India, and especially with all that's happening around the world, with regards to the G20, the BRICS summit, and the expansion, etc., it's gained a lot of coverage, and there's been a lot of reactions back and forth from different countries, etc., and for good reason. But at the same time, I don't think that and again, this is something which a lot of people in India probably do not agree with. I don't think the map thing really affected China's choices with regards to G20. I think whatever decisions that were made with regards to the attendance of the foremost leader, so to speak, were probably made for some other reason. I think to some extent it could have been related to some differences that may have emerged during our bilateral talks, because remember there were a lot of talks about some kind of informal agreement or understanding being reached out at the border. So it could have been something related to that. But I think in general, I think the most a plausible explanation is that China, in some ways, uh, wants to see India fail to some extent, and obviously, from their perspective, they have done enough in terms of being an obstacle again in producing these joint communiques documents, etc. But I don't think China is disinterested. But again, I think in terms of we keep talking about the G20 as if it's something that is going to happen. I mean, I understand the main summit is still there, but I think the G20 summit has already been it's been happening. It's not something that is there in the past, and I think from India's perspective, the main agenda, at least from the government side, was to put forth its agenda with regards to the global south, which it has done again, talking about the casualties of war when it comes to food and energy security, etc. Something we have personally talked about before. And second of all, obviously, take India's message to the world, portray itself as this, a country which is very ambitious and is out there interacting with all the major countries, has a stake in global governance, etc., etc. But to some extent, I would say that I think if we continue to look at G20 only in terms of the official outcome, so to speak, I don't think it will be something which we should be doing. Again, I think if Xi Jinping, let's say, doesn't or chooses not to attend the main summit, I think there is an opportunity for India specifically here to say or to portray this deliberate absence for this person who, remember, has, as you rightly pointed out, has been attending other kind of summits. I mean, whether it is summits with regional countries like the Central Asian Summit or the BRICS Summit, etc. Uh, Maybe India ought to. I mean, obviously, this will not be done through official channels, but from an MES perspective, China's absence there, or China, the leader of China not being present there in one of the forums, which, by the way, China has always presented as a you know as this beacon of multilateralism, something which it always favors. So, to some extent, I think what India chooses to do, not just the government per se, but the entire government machinery has done up until now. Obviously, there are domestic politics, angles there, but I think what it has done till now is to some extent put its best face on, so to speak, in front of the world, interact with diplomats and whatnot. So there has been some kind of soft power enhancing exercise that is happening. Obviously, a lot of other things like the space achievements, etc., help in that cause. But um, I think China is not disinterested. It is interested, and precisely the decision to not be there for the final and the main summit, I think it shows that to some extent it feels that it needs to do this in order to hurt India's image, and obviously, as a host, India may have been able to enhance some of what it thought was its image in the world. So if China was that disinterested, I don't think China would have made a point to not show up. Obviously, there could be other domestic reasons as well, which obviously we are not privy to. But I think China does care, and you will see that China will be very enthusiastic in the upcoming G20 summits in the next 2 years, especially the one in Brazil, in my opinion, at least.
Yeah. I didn't mean China is uninterested in G20 per se. I just meant this particular G20 summit where India is the host. Basically, that is what I meant.
I think it's India. I totally get that, but again, I think China has been, and Shashank can probably confirm this, that China has been very active when it comes to coordinating with other countries, specifically Russia, and coming up with some sort of presenting all kinds of hurdles it potentially can when it comes to the less talked about aspects of the G20 summit, or the G20 meetings, etc., that have been happening up until now. So uh, when it comes to the absence of Xi Jinping, again, something not confirmed, but I think it's again a sign that India has been doing something correct. and not I mean, I don't think we should judge uh, I mean, the summit itself by his absence. And again, I totally don't think it has anything to do with the map, because again, the whole map thing is not just a it's not just something which has happened happened before, but I think it's almost like an biennial or biannual exercise that happens to and this everybody knows, whoever follows China knows this, right? This is not the first time that they have released these kind of maps. So
It's a pattern. Whenever something
yeah.
important happens in India, they always irritate us. So that's there.
No, but that's the thing. It was not intended at India per se. This is something that they have been doing for a long time, and I don't think it was intended only at India, right? And this is obviously, I mean, this is fairly obvious from the reaction that you see from all the other countries.
Okay, Shashank, please join in. You raised your hand.
I did, just to sort of add to Rishabh's point, and we had actually done a story about this, which was how China had tried to sort of derail one of our Youth 20 summit meetings, the pre-summit meeting in Ladakh specifically, because they basically said that, look, they went and flew youth organizations to Beijing and basically said that, look, um, so youth organizations nominate Y20 delegates, and they said that, look, this is a disputed territory. You do not want to be walking into a political controversy. Don't go for this summit. And they essentially, the MEA and largely the Y20 organizations sort of snapped into um, sort of work and said that, okay, you know what, we need to sort of work at this and make sure that the Chinese can't sneak one past us on this. So the issue being, so just uh, to end any speculation about whether how the Chinese are seeing this particular thing, I think it's very clear that they have seen it in a more they have tried to disrupt, I think, our activities. Another thing is, actually, if you ask me, I kind of hope that he skips it, because Xi Jinping skips it, because for us that's a bit, because the Chinese have they have been trying for the longest time to walk this delicate line between saying the West, look, we still want to do trade with you, we still want to work with you. They've been going to Europe and saying, please invest here. We need your foreign investment, especially because our economy is struggling. And at the same time, they have to balance their relationship with Russia. So you're bankrolling sort of the Russian war in Ukraine. You're buying things from them and so on and so forth. But at the same time, you are trying to build a better relationship with the West. If he skips the summit and he and Vladimir Putin are the only two people who are not there in terms of the major leaders, then I mean that's half our job done for us, right? Because they are inextricably linked then. And then in the eyes of the world, it seems like the Sino-Russian alliance, as it was, yeah, we'll walk out of events together and we won't be present. And so I think it will be looked as petulant, as childish. And I think that, in terms of China's already tattered public reputation, I think it'll hurt it even more, because headlines will just be like China and Russia stage mutual walkout. And so their whole balancing strategy between the West and Russia, if it ever existed, will sort of be put paid to. So I think that's not a bad thing in terms of China's public reputation. I also think that if he does skip, it'll also be seen as a symbol of diplomatic isolation, because they know that, look, we're going to have to fight a rearguard action. The Russians have decided to, leave Lavrov to do the fighting, and Lavrov has, if you've ever seen Lavrov, is not exactly the nicest guy. And so they're like, okay, yeah, fine. Xi Jinping doesn't want to be at the receiving end of all the criticism in the world about Ukraine. He doesn't want to be having pull aside conversations with Justin Trudeau, who is again going to tell him, why are you backing the Russians on Ukraine, and so on and so forth. So they might just decide that it's better to leave it be. I'm, of course, speculating here, but I'm just saying that it wouldn't be the worst thing in the world. But just on China's stakes as well, like I said, they are interested. I think they have been slightly interested in creating some trouble for us with G20. But at the same time, it just makes sense for them to be at the table. It's the same way reason, for example, that we're sometimes in places like SCO and so on, which is that we also want to ensure that we have some level of influence in how the outcomes turn out. We talked about China sort of creating trouble for us. No one has sort of talked about this, or at least I would love to do the story, but I hope someone picks it up. Which is why was the SCO summit this year sort of virtual, right? Why didn't it happen in person when, in fact, it happened in person last year, right? And this is a very small thing. But I mean, the chatter, at least in the MEA press call, was that there had been a mess up somewhere, or that was the official reason, at least. But the question was, it was pressure put. Did we feel that the Chinese were going to create drama? backed by the Pakistanis, or was it Pakistanis creating drama and the Chinese backing them? But whatever. So the point being that this year, especially, I think the Chinese have been no strangers to creating sort of diplomatic trouble for us. On BRICS as well. The big question is, were we for or against expansion? Because I've heard both sides. Some people have said that, look, until a month ago, we absolutely did not want the expansion of BRICS. We wanted to keep it focused. But then apparently the Chinese went around telling people that, look, the Indians are being the bad guys on this one. And then we started getting calls from Iran and Saudi Arabia and all the developing countries, all the countries who want to get into BRICS, saying that, listen, you guys need to let us in. And so India didn't want to be the odd one out. And so fair enough, we said that, look, let's mitigate, do damage control. Let's get the countries that we know will be friendly to us. So the fact is that we don't know. But I have heard versions of the story be told that sort of point it as the Chinese have significantly been pushing on things like BRICS, on things like SCO, on things like G20. And on paper, at least, their logic for sort of minimizing our space in these organizations or making life difficult for us is very clear. They were also very clear that they don't want G20 events in Srinagar and so on, and so in Kashmir and so on and so forth. And we did one in Ladakh, which is the Y20 story I was talking about. So it seems very plausible on paper, and certain sources seem to indicate that this is what the Chinese are doing in terms of, just to answer very specifically Aditya's question about China creating trouble for us at sort of multilateral forums. That was all I wanted to say.
Just before, we move on, just like to confirm that just seen a report by, I think, the correspondent from India today, that Xi Jinping is officially, the Chinese side has conveyed that he will not be traveling. So I've been putting that as a disclaimer. So just wanted to update you with all with this thing.
Yeah.
Turned out well, I guess.
Yeah. And use now, I kind of guess it's expected, but like, has Russia given up on any multilateral forum like for foreseeable future?
I'll be honest with you. I am kind of afraid of answering on anything Russia at the moment, because you never know where the winds might take them, given what happens within the Kremlin. For the foreseeable future, let's hedge, right? There will exist tension between multilateral forums that see a high degree of participation by Western nations and with Russia, because the West's approach to what's happening in Ukraine seems to be, we're just going to pretend as if Russia isn't a meaningful partner in anything and just cut them out of everything. That being said, after the negotiations happen and things cool down, realistically, I think Russia has slowly integrated back into those multilateral forums. I don't think this is like a permanent thing. But all of this depends, of course, on how the war in Ukraine is going and when it actually ends. Because if it drags on for another year, then you never know how much more extreme things get. But that being said, I think the bigger problem with Russia that no one seems to talk about is the drastic fall in their perceived power, right? Like, for example, while everyone's talking about Ukraine, no one seems to be talking about Armenia, which right now is just literally being hung out to dry and at the whims and fancies of the Azerbaijanis. And they're absolutely taking a beating. In fact, there have been videos doing the rounds today of attacks against Armenians by Azerbaijanis, and the Armenians were complaining. I don't know if they were complaining yesterday exactly when or day before, but they were complaining that what Russia has done is an absolute farce, which is just leave them be. So there are bigger headaches for Russia that most other people are not talking about, either because they're completely obsessed over Ukraine, or that they don't care, and not that they don't care, they care about other things more than they care about what's happening in Russia's sphere of influence.
Yes, there seems to be some update. Like just before G20 summit begins, Prime Minister Modi is traveling to Jakarta, Indonesia, for ASEAN summit, India ASEAN summit, and the 18th East Asia summit. So it's a whole week, jam-packed week for the Prime Minister and the government. So next question would be basically for anyone who would like to answer. Now, the government has been consistently diplomatically signaling on the global south thing, especially addressing the African countries. We had Global South Summit, then we are trying to bring an African Union into this. Then we also, in fact, signaled Global South specifically. Prime Minister specifically mentioned Global South in the Chandrayaan 3 successful mission speech, basically. So when I'm sure it will happen, but the moment African Union will be made member of G20, do you guys think it will actually bring in significant diplomatical capital for India per se, or it will be just, oh, we love India but nothing happening in Africa in concrete terms? What do you guys think? Like, Rishabh, Shashank, anyone?
Could you just repeat the question? It sort of broke up on my end.
Yeah, I was just asking. India has been consistently putting its focus on global south, right? Like we have been consistently spending our diplomatic capital on promoting global south issues, specifically African issues, and we have spent quite a lot of time in negotiating to include African Union as a one member of G20, which may become G21 if that happens formally. After all these efforts that the government is putting in, will it be just a symbolic capital that we will get in Africa, or we would get something concrete in return, like in the longer term from the African member states? That's what my question is. Like, do we get some hard returns, or will it be only, okay, we love India, we love Indian food,
What,
Indian
how do you define? I mean, at least from your end, how do you define hard, results, so to speak?
That's what I want to know from you guys. I mean, it would be, of course, the obvious ones, economic projects
Okay,
or like.
so maybe I can like put out an opinion and maybe you can bounce off that. But like, so one area where I definitely see this helping is our own defense exports, because we've been trying to push defense exports and having and doing these sort of things where you bring in countries within Africa, or let's just use the broader term, the global south. Um, it does help us significantly. I mean, I can't like tell you, I can't give you the technical ways in which it helps, but it smoothens out the relationships and makes that country to country sale of weaponry that much easier. And in fact, you're even starting to see it. Like, so for instance, if you look at what we're doing with the Kenyans, the kind of things we're even proposing to sell to them, or a while ago we received and hosted an entire contingent of, I forget the exact organization, but a whole group of representatives from the African nations that come to Pune to see the display of weaponry India has on offer. And those kinds of things, even like 5 to 7 years ago, were quite hard to believe. So, is it to say that this is completely because of this push for including the African Union or countries within Africa? Possibly not. But from my vantage point, it does help. It does help significantly, because when you have better relationships with these countries, even if it seems quote unquote symbolic, it you never know when it may come and help you out. I mean, that this ties into the earlier point I made, right? Which is, you do want that goodwill, not because you can write on a report saying this goodwill helps in this specific sector. It's just that you never know when you need it, right? And when you do need it and it does help you, it's a major plus point. So that's at least how I look at it.
And Shashank, of course, during G20, people look out for what are the bilaterals that are happening and what are the agreements made in the bilaterals. So, do you expect any significant outcomes in any specific bilaterals?
Well, in my experience, because there's so many people, I think the prime minister as well as the foreign minister will just have maybe, because we're running in and out of the sessions and so on and so forth, they'll really have time for like 30, 45-minute bilaterals. Most of these generally just happen to be, of course, they talk about other things as well. I'm sure they push certain things or they raise certain concerns. But really, they would, sort of have a short conversation about basic priorities, discuss what's going to happen at G20, basic topics in the bilateral relationships, things they want to. For example, if Modi and Biden sat down, I would imagine one of the two of them would mention that Congress has just cleared the GE engine deal. So I'm sure they would discuss that, just basic issues in terms of the bilateral relationship. So that's just an example. I would say that, but no, I don't expect that in a 45-minute conversation, for example, much will happen on, let's say, between Sunak and the same. But for example, you might have something. Today Siddhant Sibal just reported that on the India-Canada free trade agreement, there's been a bit of a pause or a stall. And I hope the Canadian Prime Minister will be here. Maybe the two prime ministers sitting together will be able to say, listen, you want this deal, I want this deal, why can't we make it work? Right. So those are good things that prime ministerial interventions are good for. Countries both want something is stuck. You can both basically say that, look, this is our concern, and the prime minister will turn to the foreign minister and Minister Goyal and say, listen, get it done. Right. And so that's how it works. And I think that you could expect to see some of that, but I don't think it will necessarily be in the press releases specifically. And I'm sure the conversation will happen and then it'll push certain maybe stuck issues. But in 30, 45 minutes, which is, I think, as much time as the Prime Minister will have for his bilaterals, I don't think that much you can expect huge things, at least that things that you won't find out in the next, 2 or 3 weeks after the meeting is done.
Some of the things, though, I am expecting from the bilaterals would be, for instance, India might formally invite Biden for Republic Day event. At least that is what being reported. So if there's any truth to it, I think Prime Minister will officially make that request to the president. In addition to that, this would be the first meeting of Sunak and Yoon Suk Yeol, Korean president to India, and that would be significant, from at least as it's a first visit of Korean president. So that will be, at least something decent might happen there. And though I don't expect any forward movement in terms of Canada-India thing, I completely concur with what Yus has said in his initial comments. There might be few good photo ops, but I don't expect anything good to happen between India and Canada as long as Justin Trudeau continues to be what he is. And that's a big bummer in India-Canada relations, because if I'm not wrong, Stephen Harper set up bilateral relations between both the countries very well, and that has all gone down the drain.
I mean, just really quickly, the reason there is like a sort of despondency, at least not despondency, there's sort of like this whining, you can say, almost, is because of where the relationship has come to. I mean, if you remember, I think it was Milene Jolie who had done that press conference on the release of their Indo-Pacific strategy, I believe. And like the India section of it was like, yeah, we opened more passport centers, right? Like this is from literally the Indo-Pacific strategy document. We've come from Harper, right, who had grand visions of where the Indo-Canadian relationship was going to go. And make no mistake about it, given the migration flows and some of the other things that were on the table during the Harper era, this account could have been one of the most successful accounts India had, simply because of how much room there was to grow. And all of that has been turned into, Jagmeet Singh covering for Khalistanis, Justin Trudeau completely sidestepping the question. And then, they'll go ahead and use state power against their own truckers while coming to India and saying that they're extremely concerned about how we are treating quote unquote freedoms in India. And on top of that, when the Indo-Pacific strategy does come out, the role of India is, हाँ उनको passport दे देंगे. I mean, come on, like seriously. I mean, if you want to do diplomacy, don't treat us like children.
Yeah, and maybe like Sunak and the Prime Minister will intervene to speed up the free trade talks that's happening between India and UK. Though the talks seem to have gained some momentum in the past couple of months. So there is that. Beyond these things, I don't expect anything substantial from the bilateral per se. But yeah, so
From, I
someone
mean,
wants to.
just
Yes.
yeah, just to complete the point which we were talking about earlier, I'm just going to skip the Justin Trudeau thing because I think most of us are already aware of that there aren't any expectations from Canada, but I think something you were talking about earlier as to what are some of the things that we can focus on when it comes to messaging, because I think apart from the fact that obviously we'll have to focus on the joint communiques, etc., I think from an India's perspective, it's also important to sell as to what we are proposing. Obviously, at the same time, if we could pledge something, which is tangible ourselves, that would obviously be very good. Again, as we talked about, the debt relief for debt-ridden countries, especially African countries, that could be again important. But I think overall, something the question that you asked about, if India does manage to get the African Union, become a member of the G20 in the coming in this summit or in the coming summits, I think the result or the fruits of such an advocacy are not immediate always. And I think I agree with what you said earlier about inculcating that goodwill and just accumulating that goodwill will go a long way. And to some extent, this is something that India has to keep on doing, not just in G20, but in other forums as well. Again, as you pointed out before, the next summit is in Brazil. The other one will be in South Africa the year after that. So, we have to talk about what these countries
I
are going
think
through.
I think 2025 summit is in the United States, right? If I'm not wrong.
No, 2024 is in Brazil, South Africa, then United States, if I'm not mistaken.
Okay.
2026.
Okay.
So
US
I think
26.
yeah. So I think what India needs to do in this sense is talk about some of the things which are not very, let's say, fancy in our geopolitical talk and whatnot, which is very important for some of these countries. Like, remember the EU's carbon border adjustment mechanism, right? The CBAM penalties, which are essentially penalties which will be imposed against the imports of heavy industrial goods from other countries. Now, obviously, that doesn't just affect India, but other countries as well. So I think what India has to do in the coming leader summit, and obviously, I think this is what India has been doing or been trying to do in all this while, is to some way take our grievances when it comes to the lack of reform in the multilateral order, in governance structures, etc., and our priorities of what we would see change, etc., and also mash up what other some of the other countries are trying to look at when it comes to global governance. So climate assessment, climate financing, etc., use some of these things to uh, uh, portray that, okay, India is a country which will stand up for these things. Maybe pledge some commitments yourself if you are able to, especially when it comes to debt relief, which I think India has done to some extent, at least in its own neighborhood, right? Sri Lanka being the case. So talking about some of these things will go a long way, because again, remember, BRICS bank and whatnot is great. I mean, remember, New Development Bank, for example, has lent, if I'm not mistaken, over $30 billion in the last 8 to 9 years that it has been operational. And I mean, compare that to what World Bank has been doing in the year 2022, 2023 alone. I think the sum of money that they have loaned out or given is around more than 70-80 billion dollars. So my point here is that India, being an advocate on these issues, right, is not just good for its own interest, but being seen as an advocate also has its own merits. Again, being expecting too much of G20 summits in terms of deliverables might not be the best thing. So my point is that just being seen as somebody who's talking about these issues will also go a long way, irrespective of whether we can actually get the countries to agree on something or not, which has always been very difficult. So talk about these issues, and and obviously there are some other incentives as well. And again, just my last point, I think China's absence there is something that we should use to our advantage. The fact that it chooses, or the main leader chooses to be absent in a year that has seen so much of turmoil in terms of trade, investments, and financial and food security. I think something we should uh, do. Obviously, it won't be done officially, but something India's machinery has to look at, right? So, and I think bilateral photo ops and whatnot may be a good way to also signal, send some signals and feelers on that front. So that's just my take.
Yeah, so I think we have pretty much covered most of the issues that one can expect from the G20 summit. I would just like all of you to add some closing comments. Abhivardhan, would you like to add some closing comments? And I will let others then follow up with you. Follow up.
Well, I'm the host, so I would let Shashank, Yus, and Rishabh let have the closing comments.
Then we will begin with you, Shashank, please.
No, honestly, I'm just looking forward to getting cracking on this. It's going to be a very long week for me next week at least, and I'm sure for everyone on this call, who's tracking this. Yeah, honestly, I hope it turns out well. I mean, I think we all hope it turns out well for India's, because as a country, you don't get very many chances to sort of um, show up and really sort of dominate global headlines in a really big way and sort of project yourself really at the center of the conversation. And I hope that India um, will be able to use this opportunity, I think, to really dominate the conversation, shape the narrative, and really sort of project itself as a country that delivers, which is why I would hope that some policy outcomes come out of this as well. So that's the international aspect. From the domestic aspect as well, I think that, look, all of us on this call are people who have some degree of sort of fluency or understanding of foreign policy. We understand that diplomacy is sometimes, right, diplomacy over decades, years and decades, sort of generates sort of patient returns for countries. uh, but I think that on a domestic level, I would hope that we can also get some agreements, because people, I mean, my grandmother asked me, what do we get out of this? And I say that, oh, it helped my reputation a lot. And I was like, really, 1,000 crores and, a lot of resources and the public's attention and political capital. I would hope we can get something out of this, so that it sort of, even because this is a foreign policy event that, and I'm sure this will continue as a trend in our lifetimes, but for the general public, I think this is a really a foreign policy event that has really got down straight to the common man. Everyone is talking about G20. This is, and in a country where the critique is often that foreign policy is something that's for the elite, the public doesn't care about it. So I do think that if we're able to concretely get something, I mean, of course, the pageantry and the summitry and the leaders being here itself will, of course, make the country feel proud, and that's it should. But I would also hope that we get something so we can really go to the public as well and say that, look, um, we've really delivered on something, and this was worth the time and the investment, and so on and so forth. Because I think that otherwise, it's easy for people who understand foreign policy to say, "Oh, what did we get out of this?" So those would just be my final closing thoughts.
And not a bad way to get headlines immediately after getting so much good coverage through Chandrayaan
Absolutely.
3. So that's a
Correct.
That's a back-to-back good
Yeah, absolutely.
headline. So
Chandrayaan is
that's
one of
good.
those moments which you really get, as a country to really just boost your profile, and did a really good job for us. I hope G20 does something similar for us.
And also, I think this is like the final biggest foreign policy agenda of this government for this term. I mean, of course, the foreign policy will continue as an administrative function, but as far as the peak of the diplomatic agenda goes for this government's this term, this will be like the peak of it. Then, of course, then the government will go into the election mode, etc., etc. So there is that also to it. Then, Yus and Rishabh, your final comments. Yus, you can start.
Yeah. So I'll go back to what I said at the beginning. I think that despite the constant knocks about this being a talk shop and whatnot, I do think this is an incredibly positive step in the right direction for India, because it allows us to get our message across. It allows us to build goodwills. And who knows, there might have been discussions that have taken place on the sidelines that maybe 2 years from now leads to something incredibly beneficial for us. That time alone will say. And the second point is, yeah, I'm just hoping and praying, we don't see Justin Trudeau try and become more Indian than us Indians, because the last time he did that, it wasn't a good time for all of us. So I think I'll close with that.
Rishabh, the final comments are yours.
I think I agree with almost everything previous speakers have said. I think in terms of setting expectation, I think the expectations have been, already been set from the government side. And you're right, and I agree with Sashank that it's also important for the public to feel included. And I think in that sense, it's the government has done a good job in terms of trying to make this, or see this as an opportunity of a public diplomacy exercise sort of a thing. Uh, in when it comes to deliverables, I'm not so sure that G20 is the right forum, or if there could have been any result which would have affected the Indian public in a way where it would be like, oh, you know what, this is totally worth it. Um, Although I do agree that it's still important, because I'm expecting that a failure to have a joint communique would lead to some sort of questions being asked, because of obviously the fact that it's very rare that that happens. So hopefully the domestic politics does not take us away, or take us to a point where it becomes really ugly and diverts us from what all we have achieved. But I'm totally expecting that to happen. But even if it does happen, I do think people understand this, and this is something which is very difficult to understand, or for the government to convey to the people. I think when you're an aspiring power, when you're a rising power, even if you're a regional aspiring power, so to speak, as India is to some extent, it's not just important to gain or become powerful in terms of the tangible, which obviously is the most primary thing, but it's also important, especially for a country like India, which is not there yet, to be seen as powerful, to be seen as having a voice, right? And that may not be decided through G20 deliverables as yet, or only through that. So in that sense, I think India will do a good job if it continues to focus on the messaging, and that is something I think is it can be achieved through not just these official documents, but how the leaders, how the MA is able to hold the event, what kind of bilaterals it has, what kind of messaging it sends, and to that extent, I think we've achieved a lot of that already. So this is actually about status as much as it is about deliverables, etc. Although obviously that does not mean that I don't want any other deliverables, and some result will always be great. But again, also people have to realize this, and we probably don't acknowledge this, that this is the world is polarized in a way that we haven't seen in at least 2-3 decades, right? And we're going through a very big geopolitical churn. So this divide, or this, people like to say poly crisis and whatnot, so many things are happening in the world. So it's obviously difficult for people, or for any country, to get people and agree to not just documents and whatnot, but to have a common agenda. So I think India should, and people also should temper their expectation. But at the same time, I think what India can do is to speak and articulate its own position clearly, and say that it stands for XYZ things, which I think India has done to some extent, and hopefully it goes well. I really also hope that there is no untoward incidents domestically speaking, because there is a potential of that happening. So hopefully it happens, that everything is good, and we send a good message to the world about India arriving, so to, etc., etc. So yeah, that's it. Let's see. Will be an interesting week.
Yeah, so thank you everyone for joining this session on G20, India being G20 host, and what are the pre-summit expectations. Of course, Shashank, we will be expecting your short threads, like short explainer threads on all the major events. Those are really wonderful threads in getting uh, in comprehending the complex issues in simple manners. And of course, Use Finest, as usual, will give his spicy commentary on all the issues, straightforward, spicy commentary. And Rishabh, always Rishabh, everyone knows Rishabh. Uh, he explains everything in detail. So there is that. So follow all our speakers for all the interesting foreign policy, geopolitical events that's happening. They are quite a good handles to follow. So we are done for today. Abhivardhan, please inform the listeners where they can access this
Sure.
session.
Yeah. Sure. So all of you can go to Google, search the Bharat Pacific, and you can go to the bharatpacific.com. This session is already on YouTube. So even on YouTube, you can search the Bharat Pacific and you'll get our YouTube channel, or you can go to youtube.com/@Bharat Pacific. Otherwise, even on Spotify, we are available. So on Spotify, you can go to the Bharat Pacific, and you can find our content, including this session. Most probably, since the G20 summit is on 9th and 10th of September, then the week which will follow the week of the G20 summit, we will try doing a post session outcome analysis, maybe on a Friday or Saturday at 8 p.m. So I will update all of you on Twitter/X app. And yeah, it's been a pleasure to have all of you. Thank you so much, Shashank, for coming. Thank you so much, Rishabh. Thank you so much, Youth Finest. It's a pleasure to
And
have all of
please
you
to
here.
also follow Bharat Pacific Twitter handle, and or you can follow Abhivardhan, who is kind of the one who handles Bharat Pacific Twitter handle. So that's it for today. Signing off. Thank you everyone and goodbye. Happy weekend.
Thanks very much.